Hello, hello, hello. This is Tiffany with Healthy Passions. If you do not know me, I am a certified personal trainer, certified wellness coach, as well as a certified energy healer by birth. I am an oracle, prophetess, and a natural healer. Today, we're going to finish out the 613 commandments because I need to move forward. I've already moved forward in my personal studies, but I need to get some other stuff done. So we're going to try to finish these out today. So you might see maybe 1 to 2 videos since we're starting at 402, but we're going to do my best to try to get them done. Okay. So the next section that we left off of is going to be tithes, taxes, and turuma. That's T Ruma, which stands for Hebrew offering. Number 405. If I sound a little tired, it's because I did my workout, a hardcore workout right before, so cooling down now. All right, so let's go. So 402. That an uncircumcised person shall not eat of the tumora or the heave offering, Heav as in Victor E offering, and the same applies to other holy things. Period. This rule is inferred from the law of the Pascal, P as in Paul, ASCHAL offering, comma, by similarity of phrase. All right, it's going to be Exodus chapter 12, verses 44 through 45. Exodus chapter 12, verses 44 through 45, as well as Leviticus 22:10. Leviticus 22:10. It also notes, but it is not it is not implicitly set forth in the Torah. Period. Traditionally, comma, it has been learned that the rule that the uncircumcised must not eat holy things in the essential principle of the Torah and not in enactment of scribes. Okay, so I'm going to read it all together. Number 402, that an uncircumcised person shall not eat of the teruma, the heave offering, and the same applies to other holy things. This rule is inferred from the law of the Paschal offering by similarity of the phrase. Exodus 12:44 through 45. Exodus 12:44 through 45, and Leviticus 22:10. Leviticus 22:10. But it is not implicitly set forth in the Torah. Traditionally, it has been learnt that the rule that the uncircumcised must not eat holy things is an essential principle of the Torah and not an enactment of the scribes. Number 403. Not to alter the order of separating the tumorah and the tithes. The separation be in the order first fruit at the beginning, then the tumorah, then the first tithe, and last the second tithe. Exodus 22:28. Exodus 22:28. Let's read it again. Not to alter the offer of separating the tumorah and the tithes. The separation be in the order of the first fruits at the beginning, then the tumorah, then the first tithe, and last the second tithe. Exodus 22:28. Exodus 22:28. Number 405. To give half a shekel every year. In parentheses, it says to the sanctuary for provision of the public services. To give half a shekel every year to the sanctuary for provision of the public services. Exodus 30:13. Exodus 30:13. When I get stuff like that, you have to research about how much a shekel is, and then that's where you get your amount. I'm not going to make too many comments as I did yesterday because I need to get this finished. I have a lot of other work to do. All right. 405. That a priest, the Kohan, they spell it Kohan, H E as in Eric I N. That's Hebrew, I guess. That the priest who is unclean shall not eat of the tumorah. Leviticus 22, 3 through 4. That the priest who is unclean shall not eat of the tirumah. Leviticus 22, verses 3 through 4. Number 406. That a person who is not a priest or the wife or unmarried daughter of a priest shall not eat of the tumorah. Leviticus 22:10. Leviticus 22:10. 407. That a sojourner with a Kohen or his hired servant shall not eat of the tumorah. That a sojourner with a priest or his hired servant shall not eat of the turumah. And that is spelled T as in Tom, apostrophe RUMAH. And that is going to be Leviticus 22:10. Leviticus 22:10. If I am not mistaken, a sojourner is a stranger or someone traveling with you that's not a part of your fold or part of your family. All right. Number 408. Not to eat unholy things. All right. In the parentheses, something from which the tumorah and the tide have not yet been separated. So, not to eat unholy things, and in parentheses, something from which the tumorah and the tide has not been yet separated. Leviticus 22:15. Leviticus 22:15. Number 409. To set apart the tide of the produce. To set apart the tithe of the produce, in parentheses, 1/10 of the produce after taking out the tumorah. Let's read it together. To set apart the tithe of the produce, 1/10 of the produce after taking out the tumorah. Number 410. To tithe cattle. To tithe cattle. Leviticus 27:32. Leviticus 27:32. I am aware that I did not say the scripture on 409, but it's somewhere between Leviticus 22 through 27, somewhere in there. So it's probably in the same facility. I'm not going to look it up right now, but I might come back later and put a comment. 411. Not to sell the tithe of the herd. Not to sell the tithe of the herd. Leviticus 27, verses 32 through 33. Leviticus 27, verses 32 through 33. Number 412. That the Levites shall set apart 1/10 of the tithes, comma, which they had received from the Israelites, and give it to the priest. Right? In parentheses, you're going to put called the tumorah of the tithe. All right. So that's how we get that amount. That's where we get that offering from. So that's going to be Numbers 18:26. Numbers 18:26. That the Levites shall set apart 1/10 of the tithes, which they have received from the Israelites, comma, and give it to the priest. And that's going to be Numbers 18:26. 413. Not to eat the second tithe of cereal outside of Israel. Not to eat the second tithe of cereals out of Jerusalem. Deuteronomy 12:17. Deuteronomy 12:17. Not to consume the second tithe of the village outside of Jerusalem. Not to consume the second tithe of the vintage. Sorry, I said something else. Not to consume the second tithe of the vintage outside of Jerusalem. Deuteronomy 12:17. Deuteronomy 12:17. 415. Not to consume the second tithe of the oil outside of Jerusalem. not to consume the second tithe of the oil outside of Jerusalem. Deuteronomy 12:17. Number 416. Not to forsake the Levites. Deuteronomy 12:190. But their gifts, or their dues, in parentheses, DUES, should be given to them, comma, so that they might rejoice therewith on each and every festival. Okay, so I'm going to read that again. Not to forsake the Levites. That's going to be Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 190. But their gifts, or their dues, should be given to them, so that they might rejoice therewith on each and every festival. Number 417. To set apart the tithe in the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the sabbatical cycle for the poor. This is important. 417. To set apart the tithe in the first, second, fourth, and fifth years of the sabbatical cycle for the poor. Deuteronomy 14:22. Deuteronomy 14:22. 418. To set apart the second tithe in the third and sixth year of the sabbatical cycle for the poor. To set aside the second tithe in the third and sixth year of the sabbatical cycle for the poor. Deuteronomy 14, verses 28 through 29. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 28 through 29. 419. To give the priest the due portions of the carcass of cattle. To give the priest the due portions of the carcass of cattle. Deuteronomy 18:3. Deuteronomy 18:3. 420. To give the first of the fleece to the priest. To give the first of the fleece to the priest. Deuteronomy 18:4. Deuteronomy 18:4. 421. To set apart a small portion of the grain, wine, and oil for the priest. This is called the heave offering, Heave offering. Deuteronomy 18:4. Deuteronomy 18:4. To set apart the small portion of the grain, wine, and oil for the priest. Number 422. Not to expend the proceeds of the second tithe on anything but food and drink. Not to expend the proceeds of the second tithe on anything but food and drink. Deuteronomy 26:14. Deuteronomy 26:14. All right, 423. Not to eat the second tithe, comma, even in Jerusalem, comma, in a state of uncleanness until the tithe has been redeemed. Not to eat the second tithe, comma, even in Jerusalem, comma, in a state of uncleanness, comma, until the tithe had been redeemed. Deuteronomy 26:14. Deuteronomy 26:14. Number 424. Not to eat the second tithe when mourning. Not to eat the second tithe when mourning. Deuteronomy 26:14. Deuteronomy 26:14. 425. To make the declaration, comma, when bringing the second tithe to the sanctuary. To make the declaration, comma, when bringing the second tithe to the sanctuary. Deuteronomy 26:13. Deuteronomy 26:13. Give me a second. Let me see if I'm going to add this one to. All right. I'm going to keep that one to itself because I believe a lot of people have issues with understanding the tithe. So I'm going to keep that as its own little study lesson and do a second video. Give me a second.